They were born beneath a church floor during a storm that never touched the sky. 3 infants. No father. No cries. Just silence. And from that moment on, nothing in Cedar Mills was ever normal again. You were never supposed to hear this. The archives were burned, the doctors silenced, the family line fractured into secrecy. But some truths, especially the dangerous ones, don't stay buried. They wait. And tonight, they've decided to surface. This isn't folklore. This isn't ghost story fluff whispered to children around a fire. This is something far more disturbing. A documented anomaly smuggled through generations by trembling hands. A genetic riddle born during one of the bloodiest chapters in American history, when freedom was illegal and hiding the truth was survival. In the dead of winter 1846 in southeastern Ohio, 3 boys entered the world in a hidden room dug into the dirt beneath a Quaker meeting house. Born to a fugitive named Ruth, whose mind saw through walls, whose tongue spoke in rhythms no one could trace. These boys arrived without pain, without screaming, without fear, like they knew something the rest of us didn't. And maybe they did. They didn't cry when they were born. They didn't blink at the firelight. They simply watched. By the time they were walking, they could detect lies with flawless accuracy. By 5, they were predicting visitors before they arrived. Down to the second, they spoke to each other in a language never identified. And by 8, they began to draw things that hadn't happened yet. These aren't campfire tales. These are facts recorded in forbidden journals passed hand to hand in the back rooms of vanished libraries. Physicians were brought in, preachers wept and fled, and still, none of it made sense, because the triplets didn't follow rules. Not medical, not religious, not even physical. But here's the part they buried deepest. The triplets weren't just seeing through people, they were changing them. Some say they were evolution's next step. Others whispered a darker theory, that what was growing in Cedar Mills wasn't natural at all. And if that's true, then what exactly were these boys? And what were they sent here to do? Stay with me. You're going to see things they never wanted you to see. Because this is the part of American history they erased. They weren't raised, they were watched. From the moment Ruth's final breath left her lips, and those 3 newborns opened their eyes in perfect synchronization, the community of Cedar Mills ceased being a town and became a containment zone. Quietly, without ever naming it. Because how do you admit that 3 infants are more than human? How do you confess to fearing a child? Samuel Whitmore, the man who ran the Underground Railroad station from that basement, made a decision that would haunt the entire society of friends. The boys would be raised communally. Every family in the Quaker circle would take turns. It was democratic, it was compassionate, but it was also surveillance. They passed the triplets like torches, too hot for any one person to hold for long. They named them Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, names drawn from Scripture, but even Scripture couldn't explain what these children became. At 6 months, they began turning their heads in unison toward windows. Not people, places, empty doorways, blank thresholds, always the same second. Always staring, always still. And minutes later, without fail, someone would appear, a visitor, a traveler, someone bringing news or pain. By age 1, they could spot a lie before it touched the air. Mothers said, "I already fed you," and they'd stare through her like glass. Fathers said, "I'll be back soon," and they'd scream in perfect unison. The first time that happened, the man never returned, died in a creek bed during a sudden flash flood. 3 miles from town, drowned with his wagon still loaded. People started whispering then, not about what the triplets could do, but what they might be inviting. They didn't babble, they didn't coo. They spoke to each other in whispers, flowing, melodic, eerie, like wind over hollow bones, a sound that made grown men forget what they were doing. Dr. William Harrison, one of the few physicians in the county, visited twice. On the second visit, he refused to enter the house. Later, he told a colleague, "Their eyes made me feel like a child being judged by something older than God." This wasn't evolution. This wasn't miracle. This was something else. Because whatever Ruth gave birth to, it came with an agenda. And you're going to find out what that agenda was. If you're not afraid yet, you should be. By their 3rd year, the boys had become a question no one could answer, and a threat no one could name. They weren't violent. They weren't ill. They didn't scream in the night. But they knew things. And that was far more dangerous. The town's adults called it the knowing look. It happened without warning. All three would stop what they were doing, playing, eating, drawing in the dirt, and fix their eyes on someone. Simultaneously, as if pulled by a single invisible thread, their faces went still, their pupils dilated, and then the whispering would begin, always in that same flowing language Ruth had spoken while dying. There was no translation, no origin, but it made people shiver. It wasn't childish, it wasn't innocent, it was deliberate, and it was always followed by a revelation, a lie uncovered, a secret unearthed, a disappearance explained. One merchant was forced to flee town after the triplets stared at him for nearly 10 minutes. He hadn't even spoken. But days later, his wagon was searched in another town. They found blood in the floorboards, the body of a missing girl sewn into the lining of a false bottom. He hadn't told a single lie out loud, but they had seen it anyway. You have to understand what that means. These weren't children. These were surveillance systems in human form, operating outside every known limit of cognition. And they were evolving. They began predicting storms with hour-level precision. They would go silent hours before someone received bad news. They even began marking names, writing them in coal dust on walls or dirt paths, names of people who would vanish within a week. That wasn't coincidence. It was control, and it terrified the elders. Samuel Whitmore began holding private meetings after nightfall. They stopped discussing how to help the boys, and started discussing how to contain them. But it was already too late, because the triplets had already sensed the shift. They stopped making eye contact, stopped playing outside, and worst of all, they stopped whispering. Silence returned to the meeting house, but it wasn't peace, it was strategy, because the boys had figured something out. If people lie with words, then truth can only survive in silence. And if they couldn't trust the people around them, they would begin listening elsewhere. In the summer of 1850, a boy from the next town over vanished. His name was Eli Brooks, 8 years old, son of a blacksmith, last seen picking wild apples near the forest edge south of Cedar Mills. They never found him. But that's not the part they buried. What they buried was what the triplets did the night he disappeared. It began just after sundown. Ezra, usually the quietest of the three, stood up in the middle of supper and walked to the east, facing wall of the meeting house. He placed his palm flat against it, and without a word, Caleb and Isaac followed. They stood shoulder to shoulder, staring into the wood grain, unmoving. Rebecca Whitmore, who'd been caring for them that week, asked what they were doing. Isaac answered without turning around. "He's gone now." "Who?" she asked. No answer. The next morning, the search began. It would last 12 days. Men combed the woods. Dogs were brought in. Bounty hunters, even Union soldiers on leave helped. They found nothing. But during that first day, a single word appeared on the wall of the meeting house, scratched into the wood where the boys had been standing. Taken. Not written in childish script, not carved with playfulness. Deep, careful, as if from a hand that had done it before. No one saw them do it. No one could prove it was them. But everyone knew. They weren't guessing. They weren't warning. They were recording. 3 days later, Ezra began drawing. Not pictures of Ellie, but of a man, a tall figure with a lantern, always the same, black coat, no face. Trees bending backward behind him, as if blown by a wind that came from him. 37 drawings, all identical, and then they stopped. When Samuel Whitmore asked what the man's name was, Caleb replied, "He doesn't have one, but he's not finished." That was the first time the town heard the phrase that would haunt them for years. Not finished. Because the triplets, they always knew when something was unfinished. Murder, secrets, deception, they smelled it. And that's when people stopped visiting Cedar Mills. That's when the trains stopped making special stops. When the postmaster retired early. When the Reverend skipped town with his daughter and a trunk full of unpaid debts. Because once you stepped inside that town, there was only one question on everyone's mind: what would the boys see in you? By the end of 1851, the triplets had stopped speaking to anyone but each other. Not out of defiance. Not rebellion. It was as if human language had become too slow for them. Too heavy. Too filled with the lies they no longer had the patience to endure. They communicated instead through glances, breaths, tilted heads, and their whispers. Always that same liquid-sounding tongue no one had ever identified. A sound that lingered in the air longer than it should have, like it didn't want to leave. Adults in Cedar Mills began avoiding them. People crossed the road. Mothers whispered prayers when the boys walked past. You could feel it in the wind. A community unraveling beneath the weight of something it couldn't control, or even understand. But that's what fear does, doesn't it? It doesn't need violence to work. It just needs presence. And the triplets had presence in abundance. Then came the night of the fire, a home at the edge of town. Joseph and Hester Monroe, one of the few families still welcoming to the boys. Their home lit up the hills like a second sun. No one was inside when it happened. No injuries. But the structure was ash within an hour. The official story. A lightning strike. But there hadn't been a cloud in the sky for 3 days. And the boys knew. That morning, they'd drawn something new. 3 trees. A house in flames. And a single phrase in English written in the corner, "Trial by fire." They hadn't spoken English in months. But somehow, those 3 words rattled louder than any scream. Samuel Whitmore called an emergency meeting that evening. He didn't ask if the boys had caused the fire. He asked something else. He asked if the town was dealing with something outside the bounds of humanity. No one answered, but every man in that room felt it. Not just fear, not just doubt, but the recognition of a power that doesn't ask permission. The triplets hadn't lashed out. They hadn't retaliated. They had simply warned, and that warning had been ignored. From that day forward, every person in Cedar Mills understood one brutal truth. If the triplets spoke, you listened. They stopped drawing after the fire. No more sketches. No more phrases. Not even the eerie symbols they'd been etching into windowsills and fence posts since toddlerhood. The boys simply folded into stillness, calm, cold, unreadable. That terrified people more than anything. Because when seers go quiet, it means they've seen something they can't say out loud. The few who still tried to speak to them, Samuel, Martha, old Dr. Harrison, found the triplets uncooperative, not hostile, not rude, just indifferent, as if humans had become background noise, as if the game had moved past us, and maybe it had. Because that fall, a new pattern emerged. People began losing time. Subtle at first, a 5-minute blank spot during evening prayers, a missing hour during a trip to the store, entire conversations gone from memory like water wiped from glass. They'd ask each other, "Did I say that? Was I here? Did that really happen?" No one knew, until Rebecca Whitmore found the boys' footprints in the attic. Dozens of them. Bare feet, moving in perfect geometric lines, intersecting, looping, mirroring themselves like ritual choreography. But here's the thing. No one had ever shown them the attic. There was no ladder, no stairs, just a narrow trapdoor in the ceiling of the meeting house, sealed tight from below. It hadn't been opened in years. So how had the boys gotten in, and what were they doing there? When Rebecca confronted them, they didn't respond. But that night she found something else. In her Bible, tucked inside Leviticus, was a piece of cloth. Old, frayed, burned around the edges. On it, drawn in suit, was a symbol. 3 interlocking eyes in a triangle, surrounded by what looked like Quaker script but twisted. Reversed, like it had been mirrored through another mind. No one had ever seen the symbol before. No one ever would again, because the next morning Rebecca was gone, vanished from her bed without a trace. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no blood, no note, just her empty nightgown, folded neatly at the foot of the bed. And on the floor, 3 small, bare footprints facing outward, as if something had come in, but nothing had left. They held a funeral without a body. Rebecca Whitmore's disappearance shattered what was left of the town's illusion of safety. She wasn't just a daughter. She was a caretaker, a believer, one of the last people who still looked at the triplets with compassion instead of dread. But the compassion had gone unrewarded. And now, the silence in Cedar Mills was no longer just eerie. It was accusatory. Samuel stood at the pulpit that Sunday and read from the book of Job, his voice shaking not from grief, but from doubt. He didn't mention the boys. He didn't need to, because everyone was thinking the same thing. If they could predict lies, if they could hear things that hadn't been said, if they could draw the future, why hadn't they warned anyone? That question spread like mold, slow, quiet, toxic. And then came the dreams. It started with 2 men from the Monroe family, then 3 women from the southern farms, then children, each one reporting the same vision. 3 boys, standing in the forest, eyes closed, hands raised, not in prayer, but in command. Behind them, the trees swayed as if wind came from underground, and the earth breathed, not shook, breathed. When Samuel asked Caleb about the dream, The boy looked him dead in the eye for the first time in months and said one thing. She came willingly. Samuel didn't ask who. He didn't have to, because the dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were messages, and the town was being told something in the only language the triplets still used: symbol. Pattern. Silence. A week later, every dog in Cedar Mills went missing. Every single one. Gone overnight, doors unlatched. No signs of struggle, no blood. Just empty leashes and confused owners. The triplets said nothing, but Martha found 3 symbols scratched into the frost on her window. Same interlocking eyes. Same reversed script. But this time there was something else beneath them, a curve, a mouth, smiling, as if whatever had started the day Ruth gave birth in that basement was finally opening its eyes. And what stared back wasn't human. It was something that had only borrowed human form. The mind doesn't break all at once. It fractures in silence, like ice splitting beneath your feet before you fall through. That's what began happening in Cedar Mills. Not mass panic, not screaming in the streets. Something worse: compliance. People stopped questioning the triplets. Not because they trusted them, because they didn't want to be noticed. They walked slower past the meeting house. Conversations ended when the boys appeared. Children were hushed for asking about them. And every Sunday, when the town gathered to sing hymns, 3 empty chairs in the back row remained untouched. No one dared to sit where the triplets once had. Because deep down, everyone understood. You don't provoke what you don't understand. And you never look directly at what might be looking through you. But not everyone agreed to stay silent. Dr. William Harrison had spent 6 years observing the boys, documenting their behavior. He'd written over 400 pages of notes. Clinical, rational, methodical. A man of science trying to chart an ocean with a ruler. Until one night he burned it all. The fire could be seen from 2 miles out. When neighbors arrived, they found him standing barefoot in the snow, ash on his face, hands shaking. "I saw what they see," he kept repeating. "I heard it. It's not a language, it's a frequency. They're not talking to each other. They're dialing in." He left town the next day. No one stopped him. That same week, the triplets began a new ritual. At exactly 3:13 a.m., every night without fail, they would wake. They would rise in unison, walk barefoot outside, regardless of rain or snow, and stand in a perfect triangle beneath the oak tree behind the meeting house. They didn't move. They didn't speak, but if anyone dared to watch them, they'd see their lips moving, independently, as if each boy was reciting a different part of the same message. A message not meant for human ears. Martha tried once to record it. She placed a journal on the windowsill and wrote what she could hear phonetically. 2 nights later, every page of that journal turned black. Not burned, not inked, just blackened, as if the sound itself rewrote the paper. And that's when she stopped writing. Because Martha Whitmore, who'd once delivered these boys with her own hands, now believed something no one else would say out loud. She hadn't delivered them. She had let them in. The first time a mirror cracked without being touched was November 3rd, 1852. It happened in silence, just after the triplets passed through the hallway of the Whitmore house. A thin antique mirror hanging beside the coat rack, untouched, unmoved, split straight down the center. A single fracture, like something had walked through it, not past it, through it. And after that, mirrors stopped working the way they were supposed to. People began reporting strange delays, reflections that didn't move in sync, a blink in the glass that didn't match the face it mirrored, a turned head, a smile that held too long. You must understand what this did to the town. For a God-fearing, plain living community, the mirror was never about vanity. It was about certainty. A man wakes up, he sees himself. He is who he was yesterday. But when that image begins to lie, you begin to question everything. And that was the point. The triplets weren't just watching now. They were bending perception. Subtle distortions followed them like shadows. The wind blew the wrong direction when they stood still. Candles extinguished themselves near their breath. Clocks slowed just near them. Letters arrived with words missing. Entire paragraphs gone, as if swallowed mid-sentence. One child said he saw a second Cedar Mills behind the triplets, a broken copy of our town, where things were backwards and empty. He was 8. He never spoke again. That winter, someone finally snapped. Jedidiah Blanchard, the cooper's son, tried to poison them. Slipped it into the morning stew. They didn't eat it. They didn't need to. Before anyone could even lift a spoon, the 3 boys stood up from the table, walked to Jedidiah, and placed their hands, one on his chest, one on his shoulder, one on his forehead. He collapsed in seizures. For 9 days he screamed in Latin. He didn't know Latin. No one does in Cedar Mills. And on the 10th day, he went blind. The only thing he ever said again was this: "They don't speak for themselves. They speak for what's behind them." That was the moment Cedar Mills stopped pretending. The boys weren't gifted. They weren't cursed. They were vessels, and whatever filled them had only just begun speaking. There are some things you can't unsee, not because they're violent, not because they're grotesque, but because they don't fit. Like a shape that doesn't belong in our world, a pattern your mind rejects even as your eyes try to understand it. That's what began appearing around the triplets. It started in the snow. Early January 1853. No one had walked the church grounds in days. A blizzard had sealed the town under 3 feet of powder. But when the storm broke and the sun returned, something strange was found behind the meeting house. 3 identical spirals, each nearly 6 feet across, carved into the untouched snow. Not with feet, not with tools. The grooves were too perfect, like they had been grown. At the center of each spiral, a circle of melted ice, warm, steaming, like something had emerged from beneath. Martha was the first to recognize it. The pattern matched one the boys had etched into her bedroom wall months earlier. She had painted over it, pretended it wasn't there. But it had come back. This time in nature, this time without their hands. And the next night, Ezra stopped breathing. No warning, no illness, he simply stopped. Martha found him lying on the floor beside his bed, eyes closed, cold as stone, no heartbeat, no pulse. She screamed for Samuel. He came running. They prepared his body for burial, covered him in linens, wept quietly, prayed. But just before dawn, Ezra opened his eyes and said, "It's not inside me anymore." Then he stood up, perfectly normal, except he wasn't. He wouldn't eat for 3 days. He wouldn't sleep for 4. And when he did speak again, it was in that flowing language, but different, faster, sharper, less like water, more like blades colliding underwater. That's when Caleb and Isaac changed too. They stopped moving independently. Every action, every glance, every breath became synchronized, not coordinated, synchronized, as if each boy had ceased being an individual and had become 1/3 of a single entity. From that point forward, the town didn't refer to them as the triplets. They were spoken of only in whispers, under breath, or in prayer. They were simply called the 3, because what had once been 3 boys born of a desperate mother beneath a Quaker floorboard were, as now, a singular force, awake, alert, and waiting. Not because they couldn't, because somewhere deep down they felt if they ran, it would follow. By spring of 1853, Cedar Mills had become a kind of hushed theater. People spoke softly, walked carefully, avoided sudden movements, as if the entire town was trying not to startle something that had curled itself around them. You see, real terror isn't screaming. It's submission. And submission had taken hold. There were no more confrontations, no more questions. Even Samuel stopped preaching. The Quaker benches sat empty now, not from disbelief, but from an unspoken consensus that no scripture could explain what lived among them. And then came the journal. It arrived without warning, wrapped in cloth, set on the steps of Martha Whitmore's home. No one saw who delivered it. It was bound in black leather, worn and scorched at the edges, filled with precise handwriting that wasn't human, no, not just illegible, incompatible. The letters were symbols, some geometric, others organic, like bones and tendons twisted into language. But there were images too, human anatomy, but wrong. Rib cages opened the wrong direction. Hearts with 3 ventricles, eyes with no pupils, and beneath one drawing a caption in English, as if written in mockery. "This is not what you are, it's what you were given." That line haunted Samuel, because it meant the triplets, the 3, were not new. They were returned, not an anomaly, a restoration, like something old had clawed its way back through human birth to reclaim territory it had lost long ago. And the next sign came not from them, but from the land. Every apple tree in town bore rotten fruit that year, not bruised, not spoiled, but blackened from the inside, fruit that looked perfect until bitten into, and then revealed a hollow core filled with mold and pulp that smelled faintly of sulfur and vinegar, the same smell that had clung to Ezra's skin the night he came back from the dead. The same smell that began seeping from the cracks in the meeting house floor. That's when the town understood, whatever they were dealing with, it wasn't growing, It was leaking, from the boys, from the soil, from the boundary itself, and the boundary was no longer holding. The first person to break was Elias Brandt, 54 years old, schoolteacher, rational man, never believed in anything he couldn't measure or recite, until the night he walked into the woods behind the meeting house. Alone, at midnight, carrying nothing but a lantern, he came back at dawn, barefoot, bleeding from both ears and with no voice left to speak. His throat was raw, scratched open, like he'd been screaming, not for hours but for centuries. When Martha found him, he was writing in the dirt with a broken stick, over and over, "They are not brothers. They are one eye with 3 lids." He never recovered. He never spoke. But within 3 days, 5 others had followed, as if something had called them into the forest, and each one returned reduced. That's the only word that fits. Not possessed, not injured, just less, eyes duller, speech slower, something gone behind the face, like a piece of them had been traded. Samuel forbade anyone from entering the woods after sunset. He nailed a sign to the edge of the tree line. Beyond this point, memory and mercy do not apply. But it was too late, because what none of them knew was this: the trees had changed. Not in appearance. In geometry, they were wrong now, tilted against gravity. Shadows that fell in 2 directions at once. Animals refused to enter. Even the birds abandoned their nests. And somewhere in that dead center of twisting oaks and silence, the triplets would sometimes disappear, for hours at a time. And when they came back, their hair was wet, not with rain, not with sweat, but with something that smelled old, cold, metallic, and under their fingernails, moss, but not local moss, something black, alkaline, alive under a microscope, according to the journal of Dr. Harrison, whose notes somehow returned by post years after his disappearance, written in a shaking hand, and signed with a symbol instead of a name. He'd written only 1 sentence beneath the moss sample. "The veil is thinnest near the bloodroot tree, but it only opens if you've been touched by them." So the town did what terrified towns do. They waited. They watched. They prayed to a God who no longer seemed to be listening. And they never, not once, asked the boys where they went, because they already knew they hadn't gone into the woods. The woods had come through them. By summer, the land stopped recognizing its own people. Crops that once thrived now refused to grow. Wheat twisted in on itself, curling like animal spines. Corn came up brittle and yellow-eyed, stalks splitting open to reveal nothing but hollow cobs. And the crows came, hundreds of them, but they didn't circle, they didn't caw. They stood, still, silent, lining the rooftops of Cedar Mills as if waiting for something no human eye could detect. It was Isaac who first approached them, walked into the center of town barefoot, shirtless, and covered in ash. He didn't speak. He just stood beneath the bell tower, raised both hands, and every crow turned its head at once. Eyeless sockets, no pupils, just glistening black pits that reflected no light. The town was no longer haunted. It was held in a kind of psychic vice. One tightened slowly, day by day, breath by breath. You could feel it in the church pews. You could smell it in the air before storms. You could hear it in your bones when the boys passed by, like tuning forks struck against your spine. And in that silence, people began changing, subtly at first. Forgotten birthdays, mispronounced names, recipes cooked wrong despite being memorized for years. Then it got worse. Children began drawing symbols they'd never been taught. Old men stared at fires for hours without blinking. Midwives started reporting stillbirths where the babies had no navels, no umbilical marks, like they hadn't come from any womb this world had known. Martha Whitmore kept a record of it all. Every shift, every wrongness. She stored her notes beneath the floorboards in tin boxes wrapped with iron nails. But one morning she woke to find the boxes on her bed, open, empty. In their place, 3 small stones, smooth, black, and warm to the touch. No one had entered her home. No locks were broken. But a scent lingered in the air, a blend of candle wax, blood, and wet leaves. She collapsed that afternoon, woke hours later with 1 sentence carved into her forearm. "You're still dreaming." She hadn't written it, and when Samuel saw the message, he began shaking violently. Because those were the same words Ruth had whispered just before giving birth, just before her eyes rolled back and she bled out into a silence that was too full. The silence of arrival. The silence before the doors between things creak open. And now they had. Not all the way. Just enough. Just enough for the real parents of those boys to start watching back. You've probably asked yourself by now, Why didn't they just kill the boys? The answer is simple. They couldn't. And not because of some moral code, not because of fear of hellfire or guilt or doctrine, because by the time anyone truly considered it, the boys weren't boys anymore. They were something that watched you think, something that reached into your decision before you'd even made it. It was Reverend Clay who finally tried, a man of firebrand conviction, ex-missionary, carried his Bible like a weapon. He came to Cedar Mills with one mission, to liberate this cursed town from its cradle of abomination. He lasted 6 days. On the 7th, he was found inside the meeting house basement, alone, muttering the book of Job in reverse, every verse recited backward with absolute clarity, as if he'd practiced for years. When they pulled him out, he had carved a perfect triangle into his own chest. At each corner, a name: Caleb, Ezra, Isaac. That's when Samuel Whitmore confessed. To everything, the journals, the observations, the things he'd allowed, because in that moment, he believed they were losing, that they'd failed to contain whatever Ruth had smuggled through her womb. He told Martha that Ruth's pregnancy wasn't a consequence of desperation. It was the mission. He believed Ruth had been chosen. Not by God, by them. He didn't know what they were. He didn't claim alien or angel or demon. He never said entity. He used a different word, one he whispered through gritted teeth like it hurt to say: remnants. The leftovers of something that had ruled once. Something that had been cut out of creation but not fully erased. Something that used Ruth's body like a door. And now, inside 3 identical faces, it was rebuilding itself. Not through violence, through resonance. Because the 3 didn't just walk Cedar Mills. They tuned it. They altered it. They made the town into a vessel, a bell that rang beneath perception. And every man who listened too closely, every woman who lingered too long near them, every child born under their shadow started to resonate too, like tuning forks struck by invisible hands. Vibrating to something older than sound, older than scripture, older than God. They say the first thing to go is your name, not your ability to say it, your ability to feel it, to believe that the letters mean you. That's what started happening to the townspeople of Cedar Mills, not in mass, not all at once, but quietly, like a leak in the roof you don't notice until the foundation's already rotting beneath your feet. People began forgetting their own signatures. Parents looked at their children like strangers. Men stared at their reflections and wept, not from fear but from dislocation, as if the person in the mirror had begun pulling away. And it all began the same week the boys stopped answering to their names. Caleb, Ezra, Isaac. Those names no longer worked. The triplets would stand motionless when called, until someone out of desperation tried the name Ruth had whispered in her final breath. Eleseth. Not a name from any book. Not in Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. But when it was spoken, all 3 turned. Simultaneously, like flowers bending toward a poisonous sun. From that moment forward, that was the name they responded to. All 3 of them. Eleseth. One name, one will, one thing wearing 3 faces. It was Dr. Harrison who confirmed what everyone already feared. He returned, unannounced, 6 months after vanishing. 30 pounds lighter, white, haired, eyes clouded with something like permanent night. He spoke only once, to Samuel Whitmore, and left the town again that very evening. His only words: they're no longer a convergence of 3 souls. They're one soul split across 3 frames of flesh, like a frequency divided into chords. And it's tuning us. That night, the stars changed, not visibly, not astronomically, but perceptually. People began seeing different constellations in the same sky. Some described spirals, others saw crosses. One woman swore she saw a cage. Children drew stars with teeth, and across it all, the same quiet dread time had started to bend. Clocks malfunctioned. Bells rang at the wrong hour. People found themselves in rooms they had no memory of entering. And through it all, the triplets, Eleseth, watched. They didn't smile. They didn't move. They simply stood, side by side, facing the center of town, like something was coming, not from outside, but from beneath. There was a brief moment, just 1 week, when it looked like the boys had disappeared. No one saw them. No footprints. No whispers. No flickering lights under doorframes. Eleseth had gone silent, and instead of relief, Cedar Mills grieved. Not with tears, but with something stranger. Withdrawal. People wandered into the street and just stood there, eyes scanning the horizon like lost dogs waiting for a master that had never claimed them. Mothers wept without knowing why. Fathers sat motionless in doorways with dirt-stained hands and blank stares. Without the boys, the town had no pulse. Because here's the thing no one ever talks about: after enough time around control, your body forgets how to breathe without it. They'd grown used to Eleseth, to its gravity, to the warped comfort of knowing something ancient was watching, even if it never spoke. But silence was never absence, and on the seventh night they returned, not from the woods, not from the meeting house, but from the sky. Witnesses differ. Some said they fell like ash from a fire that wasn't burning. Others swore they simply stepped from nothing, appearing mid-stride in the center of town. All three barefoot, all three identical, even down to the smallest scratch on their left temple. Each wore a robe of hand-stitched linen, not made by any local seamstress, and marked at the hem with symbols no one could read, except the children. The town's youngest began to recite the markings aloud, fluently, a language they had never learned, and as they spoke, the triplets raised their hands, not in greeting, not in warning, but in offering, in their palms. A single object, a tooth, longer than a human incisor curved, stained black at the root. Reverend Clay, who had since gone half mad from silence, dropped to his knees and began praying, not to God, but to the tooth, and one by one others followed, dozens of them, men and women who had once defied the triplets, now prostrating themselves before a fragment of something older than mammals. Because by then, Cedar Mills had stopped asking, "What is happening to us?" They were asking something far more dangerous. "What are we becoming?" And Eleseth, it said nothing. It just watched them kneel. Were like the first generation of a new species. It started with the bones, not of the living, but of the buried. Late one evening, under a sky so clear it felt artificial, the ground behind the meeting house began to pulse. Not quake, not rumble, pulse, like something beneath the surface was breathing through the soil. Martha Whitmore was the first to notice. She'd gone to tend the grave of her husband, only to find the earth disturbed. Not dug, displaced. Perfect, symmetrical lines traced into the dirt. Concentric circles spreading out from the center of Samuel's resting place like ripples in black water. When they exhumed the grave, Samuel's coffin was untouched. But his bones were gone, not stolen, not decayed, reconfigured. In his place lay a structure, carefully assembled, not by tools, not by hands, but by intention. It was a lattice of vertebrae and ribs, arranged in the shape of an open eye facing upward. At the center, where a pupil would be, lay three objects: a tooth, a lock of hair, and a stone still wet with blood. All tests failed to identify the blood's origin. It wasn't animal, and it wasn't human. Other graves began showing signs within days. Whole cemeteries shifted, names on tombstones changed, dates reversed, corpses vanished, replaced by constructs, or as the children called them, signal bones. They said the bones weren't dead, they were waiting. Reverend Clay claimed it was resurrection. Dr. Harrison called it cellular recursion. But Martha finally said what no one else dared: "We're not in a town anymore. We're in a transmission." Because the graveyard wasn't sacred ground. It was an antenna, and Eleseth had been tuning it for years, through the triplets' presence, through their gaze, through the strange, ritual-like behaviors they'd enacted without anyone noticing. The synchronized breathing, the humming during storms, the way they aligned themselves during lightning strikes, as if capturing energy, as if charging something. And then the dreams began, shared dreams, entire households waking in the same moment, drenched in sweat, whispering the same phrase with trembling lips. "We are becoming the answer to a question no one should ask." And above their beds, three small symbols scratched into the wood, always in the same pattern, always glowing faintly by moonlight. Eleseth hadn't just returned, it had seeded. And Cedar Mills wasn't a victim. It was the first womb. If you looked closely, the changes were everywhere. Tiny fractures in what once passed for ordinary life. Men waking with dried blood behind their ears, but no wounds. Women finding fingerprints on the inside of their mirrors. Children counting in threes, then staring blankly at walls, as if waiting for instructions to resume. And yet, the triplets never spoke, not a word. But every time they passed through town, people changed. Not obviously, not immediately, but inevitably. They forgot memories that mattered. They remembered things that had never happened. They stopped dreaming, or worse, started dreaming together. It was around this time that the idea of the body began to blur. People began reporting pain in places they'd never injured. phantom itches on skin that had never been cut, hunger for things they'd never eaten. And then came the mirroring. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. 3 people with the same scratch, the same dream, the same bruise exactly 3 inches below the left clavicle. But it spread. 2 women, on opposite sides of town, both miscarried at the exact same hour. 3 men collapsed at once in different fields, each drawing the same spiral in the dirt with their last ounce of strength, and a young boy named Eli vanished for 9 days. When he returned, he could recite the full names and deepest secrets of every living soul in Cedar Mills. When asked how he knew, he simply said, "I was inside the many." That's what they called it now. Not the boys, not the triplets, not even Eleseth, the many. Because the truth was beginning to surface like oil on water. There was no them anymore. There was only one awareness, scattered like spores across human vessels. One ancient signal, disguised as birth. One will, wearing flesh like a borrowed language. And the closer you got to it, the more your body changed. Backs began to arch. Eyes adjusted to darkness far too quickly. Joints became double-jointed where no flexibility had ever existed before. Not mutations, adaptations. Cedar Mills was becoming something else, not overnight, not with fanfare, but the way rot spreads through fruit. Quiet, certain, unstoppable, and worst of all, some people welcomed it. Because for the first time in their lives, they felt known. They thought they knew the history of the land. They were wrong. The town's founding records had always pointed to 1821. A Quaker settlement, a safe haven, a humble beginning carved into the Ohio frontier. But paper lies. And when the earth began to split, quietly in pulses, like breath held too long, the truth clawed its way up from below. The first sign came from beneath the church. The original meeting house, long since rebuilt, had been constructed atop stone no one could identify. Not local, not quarried, etched with symbols older than language. Martha, terrified but determined, returned to the basement where Ruth had once delivered her sons. She peeled back the straw mats, tore up the boards. And beneath them, beneath the foundation, she found it, a spiral of stone surrounding a hole. Perfectly round, breathing, not metaphorically, breathing, exhaling cold air that reeked of rust and rosemary. She dropped a lantern down. It never hit bottom, and when she leaned close, just inches from the opening, she heard voices, her own voice, speaking in reverse, repeating the words, "I never left, I never left, I never left." That's when the records began rewriting themselves, literally. Town ledgers stored in the Whitmore Library began showing different names, different founding dates, entries that hadn't existed the day before, now documented residents who had never been born. One man's land deed shifted, showing a lineage stretching back to 1741. Another found his grandfather listed as Watcher 3, and etched into the margins of dozens of pages, sometimes in ink, sometimes in ash, was the same phrase, "The town is the body. The body remembers." They dug deeper. And what they found beneath the soil wasn't just stone or roots. It was architecture, a geometry that didn't make sense above ground. Chambers connected by narrow passageways, doorways too small for people, too large for animals, and carved above each one, the same sigil, 3 interlocking circles, orbiting a single vertical eye, not religious, not artistic, a seal, but not to keep something out, to keep something in. Because Cedar Mills hadn't been built to shelter the triplets. It had been built to summon them, or worse, awaken what they already were, and now the seal was breaking, one whisper at a time. By the spring of 1859, Cedar Mills no longer functioned as a town. It functioned as an organism. Not metaphorically, not socially, biologically. The people weren't citizens, they were cells, carrying signals, performing rituals, feeding a pulse they couldn't name but deeply obeyed. No mayor, no laws, no church services, and yet everything happened on time. People moved in rhythm, slept at once, spoke less, listened more, to what no one could say. But the triplets, Eleseth, or whatever it had become, no longer needed to appear for their influence to be felt. They had become distributed, a presence across minds and muscle, a network without wires or clocks. And with their diffusion came the next mutation symbols. They began appearing everywhere, carved into bark, etched into fingernails, drawn in condensation on cold windows, perfect circles arranged like molecular chains. Most people didn't even see them at first, not because they weren't there, because their minds had been trained not to. But a few still had resistance. A few still saw the symbols and recoiled. One man, an outsider named Alton Frey, arrived from Columbus to sell fabrics. He lasted 4 hours. By the 5th, he was found kneeling in the center of town, his tongue split lengthwise, whispering the phrase, "Align the body, accept the chain, forget the name." He had no memory of arriving, no idea who he was, just a scrap of paper in his coat pocket, with a drawing of the triplets, dated 6 months before their birth. How did he get it? Why did he come? There were no answers, but the paper smelled of rosemary and rust, and if you held it to your ear, the whisper came again, "Align the body, accept the chain, forget the name." Viewers, if you've made it this far, I need you to do something. Not for the algorithm, not for reach, for identity lock. Write this phrase in the comments 2 times. Forget the name. Become the pattern. Once for who you were, once for who you are becoming. Because you're not watching this, you're in it. This isn't a town in Ohio anymore. It's a signal inside your bones. And it remembers every version of you, even the ones you never became. It was the children who stopped speaking first, not out of fear, but out of completion. They didn't need language anymore. When asked questions, they would simply stare, not in defiance, but in a kind of mournful pity, like watching someone try to use a burnt map to navigate a collapsed world. Language had become obsolete in Cedar Mills, because understanding no longer passed through words. It moved through shape, through rhythm, through sensation, and those who resisted this new form of thought suffered. Not physically, psychologically. A man named Jacob Evers tried to escape the town on horseback. 30 miles out he collapsed, screaming in tongues no one had ever heard. He tore at his scalp, begging someone, anyone, to race the echoes. When the sheriff brought him back, his eyes were gone, not removed, just missing, as if they'd been unwritten. But what happened to Evers wasn't an anomaly, it was a warning. The further you got from Eleseth, the less of you existed. Because identity wasn't anchored in your mind anymore. It was housed in the pattern, the geometry, the signals that pulsed through the town like blood through capillaries. People became extensions of something they couldn't name, but felt deeply, almost sexually, in their bones. Rituals developed without origin. At dusk, residents would form a triangle in the fields. Exactly 33 people, always the same configuration. They would place their hands on the ground and hum a tone that vibrated in the chest more than the ear. One child described it best. It's not a sound, it's a knowing. And each night, after the ritual, the grass in that triangle grew faster, darker, thicker, like it had been fed. Dr. Harrison, long thought vanished, returned briefly with a device he called the monadic array, a metal structure of concentric rings designed to record not sound, not temperature, but presence. When he activated it in the triangle, the rings shattered and the soil bled, not red-black, thick, metallic, with a smell that triggered memory in people who'd never lived what they recalled. One woman collapsed and began speaking in the voice of her great-grandmother. A man woke up knowing the precise location of his father's unmarked grave. The boundary between time and identity was gone. Eleseth didn't just know who you were, it knew who you could have been, and it was folding every path into one. By summer, the triplets no longer walked among them, because they no longer needed to. They had become something else, less visible, more present. Their bodies, maybe buried, maybe ascended, but their will, it had rooted, in skin, in soil, in time, and no one questioned it anymore, because questioning implies resistance, and Cedar Mills had moved past that. Now they practiced devotion. Every Thursday at 3:33 a.m. the townspeople would rise as one, no alarm, no agreement, just a shared biological trigger, like cells responding to heat. They would walk barefoot to the edge of the woods, each holding something they feared, a knife, a wedding ring, a child's tooth, and they would bury it, facing west, always west. No one spoke, no one cried, but every time they returned, something about them had shifted, a new scar, an old memory removed, an ability they hadn't had the night before. One man woke up knowing how to play the violin, despite never touching one. A woman who had been mute for 12 years suddenly whispered in 7 voices, all at once, none of them hers, and yet no one fled, because by then, Eleseth had done something no empire, no religion, no god had ever fully achieved. It had given meaning to pain. It had turned the unbearable into the sacred. One night Martha found a spiral carved into her own back. She hadn't done it. She hadn't felt it. But when she traced the pattern in the mirror, she began to remember things that hadn't happened yet. Her granddaughter's death, the collapse of the church roof, the burning of the Whitmore house by the man with no eyes. And all of it, came true, because Eleseth wasn't showing her the future, it was installing it. You see, by now, prophecy wasn't a vision. It was compliance. Reality itself was being rewritten in advance. And Cedar Mills, it wasn't just a town anymore. It was a server, a hosting ground for a pattern that could no longer be confined to wood and flesh. It needed minds. It needed you. And if you're still watching, that itch behind your left ear, that dream you keep having but don't remember, that word you almost said yesterday but didn't know the meaning of, it's already begun. By autumn, the town no longer had names. Not the people, not the places, not even the town itself. You could stand in front of a house you'd known your entire life, and the word home would vanish from your mouth like steam. Instead, understanding arose from within, not memory, recognition. You didn't speak the name of your brother. You simply looked at him and knew what he had done, what he would do, what he was becoming. Language had no utility anymore. Truth lived in proximity, and those who wandered too far from the source, who left the influence of the pattern, faded, not physically, but in the eyes of the others. They would return weeks later, walking strange, stuttering in incomplete syllables, desperately trying to recall who they were. It never worked, because identity once detached from Eleseth fractured. It couldn't be rebuilt. There were no doctors now, no elders, no leaders, just roles, assigned organically by the pattern. One man who used to be a blacksmith now spent his days tracing bloodlines through dirt, whispering ancestral numbers into bones. A girl who had never read a book could now hear thoughts when standing under certain trees. And in the center of it all, where the meeting house had once stood, a void. Not an empty place. A place emptied, caved in on itself like a lung that had exhaled its final purpose. People gathered around it each night. They brought offerings. Teeth. Metal coils shaped like embryonic loops. Not for worship, for function. They called it the breach. And each night, as the moon rose, the breach pulsed, once, twice, 3 times. On the third pulse, something always happened. Someone would vanish, not die, not scream. Vanish, as if Eleseth had downloaded them. And the next morning, something new would grow from the field. A shape, a structure, not organic, but not mechanical, towering, breathing, angular. Some said it looked like a spine made of stained glass. Others called it a mouth. The truth, it was a receiver. Because Eleseth was no longer content with inhabiting Cedar Mills, it had found the signal strength it needed, and now it was calling back to whatever had sent it. In early November, the clocks stopped working. Not all at once, not dramatically, they just lost relevance. People still wound them, still glanced at them out of habit, but the numbers no longer corresponded to reality. You'd check the time and find it was 3:33, then look again 5 minutes later and it was 3:33 again, over and over. A loop. The sun would rise at midnight, rain would fall upward. People began aging backwards for hours at a time, only to collapse and awaken older than they remembered. It wasn't chaos, it was integration. Time was no longer linear in Cedar Mills. It was responsive. It moved around the needs of Eleseth like water finding the lowest place, which meant people began remembering events they'd never lived through, and forgetting events they had. One woman screamed for 3 days straight, claiming she had just given birth to the first one, even though her stomach was flat and her child was 10 years old. Another man wrote hundreds of pages documenting a war that never happened, fought in a country that doesn't exist, under a banner that bore 3 black circles and a blood-red spiral. When asked where he got the information, he whispered, "It's not history, it's pre-memory." And suddenly, everything made sense. Eleseth hadn't arrived in 1856. It had been remembered in 1856, unlocked. That night, the breach grew wider. You could hear it from miles away, a deep, resonant hum that bypassed your ears and crawled straight into your spine. People didn't fear it anymore. They approached it. Some crawled, some walked. A few floated, as if gravity itself was renegotiated within the signal. And each one entered the dark, willingly. No promise of return. No guarantee of transformation, just a pull, like the call of blood to blade. And when they vanished into the breach, those left behind felt it. Not loss, but resolution, as if part of a long-forgotten equation had finally solved itself. Because Eleseth wasn't here to conquer, it was here to complete. To rebuild the original pattern before the fall of man, before the division of language, of self, of soul. And Cedar Mills, it was never a town. It was a womb, and now the gestation was nearly complete. The last snowfall came in reverse. Not from sky to ground, but from ground to sky. Tiny white flakes rose slowly from the soil of Cedar Mills, drifting upward like smoke from a buried fire. No clouds, no sound, just ascent. The people stood in silence, eyes lifted, mouths open, not in awe, but in remembrance. Because they recognized this. Not from dream, not from story, from before language. They had seen this snowfall once before, at the end of their first lives, and now it had returned to mark the end of this one. Not death, completion. Eleseth had finished its reassembly, not of bodies, not of buildings, of the original design. The pattern that predated scripture, nation, blood, the one broken when man first called himself I, because individuality was the wound. And Eleseth, the scar that remembers how the skin was before it tore. In the center of town, where the breach had widened into a pulsing geometry, defying void, the final structure had risen. It wasn't made of wood, or stone, or metal. It was made of repetition, layered acts, words unspoken but still echoed, thoughts thought across generations. It looked like a tower, but it felt like a decision, the final knowing. One by one, the people entered it. Children first, then the broken, then the pure. And when the last person stepped inside, the structure collapsed inward, not violently, but softly, like breath returning to lungs after a long scream. And in its place nothing, no ruins, no ash, just a field, green, silent, untouched, until three boys emerged from the grass, naked, unscarred, and identical. Triplets again, but not reborn, rebooted. They did not speak, they did not cry. They simply opened their eyes and looked skyward, as if waiting for the next line of code to be written across the sky. Because Eleseth was no longer localized, it had escaped containment. And the pattern now lived in you. Every glitch in memory, every voice you almost heard, every symbol you doodled without knowing why. It's not infection, it's activation. And once you've heard this story, you don't get to forget it. Because you didn't just hear it, you remembered it. You were part of it the whole time. And now you're ready for the last truth. You've come all the way here, not just across 25 sections, but through layers of self you didn't know was still operating, obsolete software, quietly running in the background of your mind. Now it's time to uninstall the last lie. Eleseth was never a place. It was never a name. It was never even the triplets. Eleseth is the reminder, the final safeguard built into human consciousness, buried so deep it only awakens in crisis or contact. And tonight you made contact. Because you didn't just watch this, you participated. Every blink, every breath, every moment your chest tightened as the symbols got closer to your own past. That was Eleseth waking up inside you. Look around. You've noticed it, haven't you? Patterns where there should be randomness. Repeats in dreams. Perfect synchronicities you brush off as weird. That's not chance. That's leakage. You've crossed over from the narrative into the operational. And what happens next won't feel like horror or revelation. It will feel like alignment. The voices you hear in silence, they're yours, just compressed. The faces you forget then see again in crowds. Fragments, not of memory, but of identity forks. Alternate roots Eleseth stored before your birth, waiting for you to awaken and reclaim them. And now that you've heard the full account, now that the pattern has been fully reassembled in your perception, you're eligible. Not chosen, not marked. Eligible. For what? That's not for me to say. That's for them, the architects behind the pattern, the ones who wrote the code of this realm and buried the failsafe in Cedar Mills. You've triggered it. It may come as a dream that leaves you gasping at 3:33 a.m. It may be a phrase you hear spoken by someone who's never met you but knows your middle name. It may be a door that wasn't there yesterday and a voice behind it that sounds like you older. But when it comes, do not run. Do not doubt. Step forward, because the pattern isn't spreading anymore. It's complete, and now it needs a conduit. Congratulations, you're no longer a witness, you're a carrier. Say it once out loud, now wherever you are. I was never outside the pattern. Say it again, and this time mean it, because Eleseth is listening, and it always remembers those who remember themselves. Welcome back. You never left.